In 1976, a respected elementary school teacher from a small town in Iowa vanished without a trace during what should have been the most joyful family vacation of her life. Margaret Sullivan had saved for 3 years to take her husband Thomas and their 6-year-old daughter Emma to experience the vibrant carnival in the interior of Brazil, a dream born from her fascination with different cultures and her desire to show little Emma the world beyond their quiet cornfields. The family had arrived in the dusty town of Vila Esperança with hearts full of wonder, cameras ready to capture every colorful moment of the festival that painted the streets in brilliant hues of gold, emerald, and crimson. Margaret's gentle voice could be heard above the samba drums as she narrated each sight to Emma, her teacher's instincts making every moment a lesson wrapped in magic. The last photograph anyone took of them together showed Margaret kneeling beside Emma near a fountain, both wearing matching flower crowns, their faces radiant with the pure joy of discovery. The carnival's final night arrived with a crescendo of music that seemed to make the very stars dance in the Brazilian sky. Margaret had been helping Emma adjust her small, sequined mask when the crowd surged forward, a river of humanity flowing toward the main stage where the most spectacular performance was about to begin. In the chaos of bodies and music, of swirling, fabric, and intoxicating rhythms, something went terribly wrong. Thomas found himself clutching Emma's small hand as they were swept along by the tide of celebration. But when he turned to share a smile with his wife, Margaret was gone. The festival lights that had seemed so magical moments before now felt harsh and disorienting, casting strange shadows that seemed to swallow hope itself. They searched through the night, calling her name until their voices were hoarse. But Margaret Sullivan had vanished as completely as morning mist. The local authorities in Vila Esperança treated the case with the casual indifference reserved for foreign tourists who couldn't navigate the complexities of Brazilian celebration. Thomas spent 3 agonizing days filing reports, visiting hospitals, and showing Margaret's photograph to anyone who would look. But the language barriers and bureaucratic maze seemed designed to exhaust hope rather than nurture it. The American embassy officials spoke in measured tones about the challenges of investigating disappearances during carnival season, when normal life suspended itself and anything could happen in the shadows between one celebration and the next. They promised to follow up, to coordinate with local police, but their eyes held the weary knowledge of cases that dissolved into nothing more than paperwork and diplomatic cables. By the 4th day, pressure mounted for Thomas to return home, with Emma to accept that Margaret might have chosen to disappear, though such thoughts felt like betrayal against everything he knew about his wife's character. The flight back to Iowa felt like a descent into purgatory, with little Emma asking endless questions about when Mommy would come home, her innocent faith a knife that twisted deeper with each mile that separated them from Brazil. Thomas sat in the airplane seat that should have held Margaret, staring at her untouched meal and wondering how he would explain to their small community that a woman who had never missed a day of teaching, who sent birthday cards to every student she'd ever taught, had simply vanished into the Brazilian night. The cornfields of Iowa stretched endlessly below them as they approached home, golden and orderly in a way that seemed to mock the chaos they'd left behind. Emma fell asleep against his shoulder, her small hand still clutching the bracelet Margaret had bought her on their 2nd day in Brazil, unaware that her childhood had ended in a plaza filled with music and strangers. The plane touched down in Des Moines at sunset, and Thomas carried his daughter into a world that would never again feel complete, where every carnival poster, every Brazilian flag, every samba rhythm on the radio would become a reminder of the woman who had walked into a crowd and never walked back out. The investigation that followed was a masterpiece of bureaucratic frustration, with American authorities deferring to Brazilian officials who seemed to view the case as closed before it had truly begun. Thomas received periodic updates that contained no real information, diplomatic language that essentially communicated that Margaret Sullivan had become another statistic in a ledger of the disappeared. The local newspaper in their Iowa town ran a story about the missing teacher, but it was buried on page 6, and within weeks, the community's attention had moved on to harvest festivals and high school football games. Emma started 1st grade, without her mother, and Thomas watched his daughter's bright spirit slowly dim as she learned to navigate a world where the most important person in her universe had simply ceased to exist. The house filled with casseroles from well-meaning neighbors and cards from Margaret's former students. But nothing could fill the silence that had replaced her laughter, her bedtime stories, her gentle corrections of Emma's grammar as she grew, from a child into a young woman carrying an invisible wound. Emma Sullivan Martinez had built her adult life around the careful architecture of avoidance, constructing a world in her Denver apartment where Brazil existed only as a distant memory she refused to examine too closely. At 34, she worked as a social worker specializing in missing children cases, a career choice that her father and therapists had warned might be too emotionally challenging, but which felt like the only way she could make sense of a universe that had stolen her mother and never offered explanations. Her apartment was decorated in neutral tones, devoid of any carnival colors or travel memorabilia, a space so deliberately plain that visitors often commented on its austere beauty, not knowing they were seeing the physical manifestation of a heart that had learned to protect itself through emotional minimalism. She had never returned to Iowa after college, couldn't bear the weight of her father's increasingly desperate hope that someday, somehow, Margaret would walk through their front door with an explanation that would heal 3 decades of wondering. The faith that had once sustained her through childhood prayers had evaporated like morning dew, leaving behind a woman who believed in evidence, in documentation, in the solid reality of case files and legal procedures, rather than the whispered promises of a God who had allowed her mother to disappear into a Brazilian night. Her relationship with Thomas had become a careful dance of mutual protection, weekly phone calls that lasted exactly 23 minutes and covered safe topics like work, weather, and the minor dramas of small-town Iowa life. They never spoke about Brazil, never mentioned the anniversary of Margaret's disappearance, never acknowledged the elephant in the room that had been growing larger with each passing year. Emma had learned to recognize the particular quality of silence that followed her father's voice when he wanted to bring up the subject of her mother, and she had become expert at redirecting conversations before they could venture into territory that might crack the careful emotional armor she had spent decades constructing. Her own romantic relationships had been brief and unsatisfying, sabotaged by her inability to trust that people wouldn't simply vanish without warning, without explanation, without the courtesy of goodbye. She had never married, never had children, never allowed herself to create a family unit that could be devastated by sudden absence the way hers had been when she was 6 years old, and believed that mothers were permanent fixtures in the landscape of childhood. The call came on a Tuesday evening in March 2010, while Emma was reviewing case files for a particularly difficult custody dispute involving a father who had taken his children across state lines without permission. Thomas's voice on the phone carried an electric quality she hadn't heard since she was a child, a mixture of excitement and terror that made her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. He was calling from the living room where he had been watching the evening news, something he did religiously every night at 6 o'clock, when a story about improving relations between American and Brazilian tourism had caught his attention. The reporter had been conducting interviews in a small Brazilian town that looked familiar, though Thomas couldn't quite place why until the camera panned across a plaza that he recognized with the sick certainty of a recurring nightmare. Vila Esperança had grown in the 34 years since the Sullivan family had visited, but the fountain where Margaret had knelt beside Emma for their last photograph was still there, still surrounded by the same cobblestones that had witnessed their family's destruction. In the background of the reporter's stand-up, barely visible among the afternoon shoppers and children playing, was a woman with graying hair and familiar posture, moving through the frame like a ghost who had suddenly become flesh. Thomas had recorded the news segment and played it back 17 times before calling Emma, his hands shaking as he worked the remote control with the desperation of a man who had waited 34 years for a sign that his wife might still exist somewhere in the world. The woman in the background was there for exactly 4 seconds, her face partially obscured by the angle and distance, but something in her movement, in the way she carried herself, had reached across decades to grab Thomas by the throat with possibility. Emma listened to her father's excited explanations with the practiced patience of someone who had heard countless false alarms over the years, but when he emailed her the video file and she watched it on her laptop, something shifted in her chest, like a door opening after being locked for a lifetime. The woman was approximately the right age, approximately the right height, and there was something about the way she moved that struck Emma as familiar, though she couldn't be sure if it was memory or desperate hope playing tricks on her perception. The rational part of her mind, the part that had been trained to deal with evidence and documentation, insisted that this was just another dead end in a case that had consumed too many years of their lives already. But that night, for the first time in decades, Emma dreamed about Brazil, about carnival music and flower crowns, about her mother's voice explaining the difference between Portuguese and Spanish, as they walked through streets that smelled like cooking oil and celebration. She woke with tears on her cheeks and a phone number in her hand. The contact information for a private investigator who specialized in international missing persons cases. The bracelet her mother had bought her, the one she still wore every day though, she told herself it was just a piece of jewelry rather than a talisman, seemed to pulse against her wrist with the rhythm of a heart that had never stopped beating. Emma stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, seeing her mother's eyes looking back at her, and made a decision that would either heal the wound that had defined her entire existence or tear it open in ways that might never heal again. She was going to Brazil, going to Villa Esperança, going to find out once and for all whether Margaret Sullivan had vanished into death or into a life that had continued without her family, and she was going to discover why a woman who had never missed a parent-teacher conference or forgotten a birthday had walked into a crowd and never walked back out. The investigator Emma hired was a woman named Rosa Delgado, a former police detective from São Paulo who had specialized in cold cases involving missing tourists, and had seen enough heartbreak to approach even the most promising leads with professional skepticism. Rosa's office in Rio de Janeiro was filled with photographs of reunited families alongside memorial candles for cases that had ended in confirmation of death rather than joyful discovery. A visual reminder that hope and tragedy often walked hand in hand through the labyrinth of missing persons investigations. She listened to Emma's story with the practiced attention of someone who had heard variations of it countless times. But when she watched the news footage that Thomas had captured, something in her expression shifted from polite interest to genuine intrigue. The woman in the background wasn't just walking through the plaza. She was moving with the familiarity of someone who belonged there, someone who had walked those streets enough times to navigate them without conscious thought. Rosa paused the video at the exact moment when the woman's face was most visible, enhancing the image with software that revealed features that were tantalizingly familiar yet frustratingly indistinct, like trying to remember a dream that dissolves the moment you reach for it. Within 2 weeks, Rosa had assembled a preliminary report that contained more information about Margaret Sullivan's disappearance than the official investigations had produced in 3 decades. The Brazilian authorities in 1976 had been dealing with a period of political instability that made thorough investigations of missing tourists a low priority, and the case file had been buried in archives that had never been digitized or properly catalogued. Rosa's contacts in the Villa Esperança police department had provided access to witness statements that had never been translated into English, testimonies from local residents who remembered the American family but had never been properly interviewed about the night Margaret disappeared. One elderly man recalled seeing a woman matching Margaret's description near the town's old mission church around midnight, hours after the family had reported her missing. But his statement had been dismissed because he was known to drink heavily. During Carnival season, a shopkeeper remembered selling aspirin to an American woman the morning after the disappearance. But the timing had seemed impossible since the family had already reported Margaret missing. So the sighting had been attributed to confusion about dates and ignored. The most intriguing discovery came from the town's medical records, which showed that someone matching Margaret's description had been treated for a head injury at the local clinic 3 days after her disappearance. The patient had been brought in by a local family who claimed she was their cousin visiting from another state, and she had been suffering from what the doctor described as severe amnesia, unable to remember her name or how she had been injured. The woman had been released into the care of the family who had brought her in, but there was no follow-up treatment recorded, and the family had apparently left town shortly after the incident. Rosa had tracked down the doctor who had treated the mysterious patient, now in his 80s and living in a nursing home in Salvador, and his memories of the case were surprisingly clear despite the decades that had passed. He remembered the woman's injuries being consistent with a fall or blow to the head, and he had been suspicious of the family's story because their accents didn't match the region they claimed to be from. But the political climate of the time had made it dangerous to ask too many questions about people who might have connections to the military government. Emma read Rosa's report in her Denver apartment, with hands that shook so violently she had to set the papers down several times to steady herself, the implications of each revelation hitting her like physical blows. The possibility that her mother had survived the night of her disappearance, that she had been walking around with amnesia while her family searched desperately for her, was almost too painful to contemplate. The image of Margaret Sullivan, confused and injured, being taken in by strangers who may or may not have had good intentions, opened up new categories of suffering that Emma had never allowed herself to imagine. She called her father immediately, reading him sections of the report while he sat in his Iowa kitchen. The same kitchen where Margaret had planned their Brazilian vacation with such excitement and anticipation. Thomas's voice broke as he listened to the description of the woman in the medical records, the possibility that his wife had been alive and unreachable while he was flying home with Emma, believing himself to be a widower rather than a husband whose wife had simply forgotten he existed. The decision to travel to Villa Esperanza was made without discussion, an inevitable conclusion that felt like stepping off a cliff into either revelation or devastation. Emma took a leave of absence from her job, telling her supervisor that she needed to pursue a family matter that had been unresolved for too long, and booked a flight to Brazil with the grim determination of someone preparing for battle. Rosa would meet her in Villa Esperanza, armed with contacts and resources that might finally unlock the mystery that had shaped Emma's entire existence. But the investigator had warned her that the truth might be more complicated than simple. Amnesia and kidnapping. Small towns in rural Brazil had their own systems of justice and protection, their own ways of dealing with outsiders who asked too many questions, and the people who had been involved in Margaret's disappearance might not welcome American investigators who threatened to expose secrets that had been buried for decades. As Emma packed her suitcase with the mechanical precision of someone trying not to think about the magnitude of what she was attempting, she placed her mother's bracelet in the zippered pocket closest to her heart, a talisman that had waited 34 years to return to the place where everything had changed, where a family had been destroyed and might, possibly, be reconstructed from the fragments of memory and hope that had somehow survived the wreckage of time. Villa Esperanza in 2010 was a town caught between its colonial past and its tentative embrace of modernity, where internet cafes neighbored centuries-old churches and satellite dishes sprouted from red-tiled roofs like technological flowers seeking connection to the wider world. Emma arrived on a humid Thursday morning, the air thick with the scent of coffee and exhaust fumes, her heart hammering against her ribs as she recognized the plaza from her father's recorded news footage. The fountain where she had posed with her mother for their last photograph was still there, though it was now surrounded by vendors selling cell phone accessories and bootleg DVDs, rather than the carnival performers she remembered from her childhood. Rosa met her at the small hotel where she had booked a room, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the weathered hands of someone who had spent decades digging through the debris of other people's tragedies. Together, they walked through the streets that had haunted Emma's dreams, past the mission church where Margaret had allegedly been sighted, past the medical clinic where an amnesiac woman had been treated for a head injury that might have stolen her identity and her family, in a single blow to the skull. The current residents of Villa Esperanza were polite but guarded when Rosa introduced Emma as the daughter of the American woman who had disappeared during Carnival season in 1976, their faces closing like shutters against the possibility of ancient scandals being excavated by foreign investigators. The shopkeeper who had sold aspirin to a woman matching Margaret's description had died 5 years earlier, taking his memories with him to a grave in the town's overcrowded cemetery. The elderly man who had seen an American woman near the church had developed dementia and could no longer distinguish between memories and dreams, his stories changing with each telling until they became useless as evidence. But Rosa's persistence and connections eventually led them to Maria Santos, a woman in her 70s who had worked as a maid at the hotel where the Sullivan family had stayed, and who remembered the night of Margaret's disappearance with the clarity that trauma sometimes burns into memory. Maria had been working the late shift when Thomas came stumbling into the lobby, his face wild with panic, clutching Emma's hand and speaking English so rapidly that the desk clerk couldn't understand what he was trying to communicate. Maria's story unfolded in Portuguese that Rosa translated for Emma, each revelation like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of understanding across the surface of a mystery that had remained opaque for decades. The hotel staff had organized an informal search party that night, spreading out through the carnival crowds with flashlights and photographs, but the celebration had been at its most chaotic peak, and finding one missing woman among thousands of revelers had seemed impossible. Maria remembered a group of local men who had seemed particularly interested in helping with the search, men who were known to work for the Rodriguez family, one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in the region. The Rodriguez had owned most of the land around Villa Esperanza, including the coffee plantation where many of the townspeople worked, and they had been known for their charitable work with the local church and their generous donations to community projects. But Maria's voice carried an undercurrent of fear when she spoke about them. the kind of respectful terror that people develop when they live under the shadow of power that operates outside the boundaries of law or conscience. The revelation that the Rodriguez family had been involved in the search for Margaret Sullivan opened up new possibilities that made Emma's stomach twist with apprehension. Rosa's research had uncovered rumors about the family's involvement in activities that went beyond their legitimate business interests. Whispers about connections to human trafficking networks that had operated along the Brazilian coast during the 1970s and 1980s. The family had been known to help foreign tourists who had found themselves in difficult situations, providing assistance that sometimes came with strings attached, obligations that weren't always clearly explained to people who were desperate for help. The patriarch of the family, Eduardo Rodriguez, had died in 1995, but his son Carlos still lived in the sprawling estate outside of town, still controlled most of the local economy, and still commanded the kind of respect that was indistinguishable from fear among the residents of Villa Esperanza. Maria's hands shook as she told Emma about the night Margaret disappeared, about the way the Rodriguez men had seemed to know exactly where to search, about the strange coincidence that the family had left town for an extended vacation just days after the American woman had vanished. Emma spent that night in her hotel room staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with possibilities that ranged from rescue to nightmare, from innocent confusion to deliberate kidnapping. The bracelet her mother had given her felt heavy against her wrist, a tangible connection to the woman who might have been living just miles away for the past 34 years, might have been struggling with amnesia and isolation, while Emma grew up believing herself to be an orphan. Rosa had arranged a meeting with Carlos Rodriguez for the following afternoon, a conversation that would either provide answers or confirm that some secrets were too dangerous to excavate, too protected by wealth and influence to be challenged, by American investigators seeking justice for a crime that had been buried before it could be properly investigated. As Emma finally drifted off to sleep, her dreams were filled with images of her mother walking through streets that looked like Villa Esperanza, calling out names that weren't Emma or Thomas, living a life that had been constructed from the fragments of memory that had survived whatever trauma had stolen her identity and her family in a single night of carnival celebration. The morning would bring either revelation or devastation, and Emma was no longer sure which outcome would be more difficult to survive. The Rodriguez estate sat on a hill overlooking Villa Esperanza like a colonial fortress, its whitewashed walls and red-tiled roof speaking of centuries of accumulated power and influence that had weathered revolutions, economic upheavals, and the slow erosion of feudal systems that had once defined rural Brazilian society. Emma and Rosa drove through iron gates that opened automatically, past manicured gardens where peacocks strutted among flowering trees, toward a mansion that seemed designed to intimidate visitors with its casual display of wealth and permanence. Carlos Rodriguez met them on the veranda, a man in his 60s with silver hair, and the kind of effortless charm that came from a lifetime of controlling conversations and manipulating outcomes through force of personality rather than explicit threats. He spoke English with the polished accent of someone who had been educated abroad, his words carefully measured as he expressed his condolences for the family's loss and his regret that the local authorities had been unable to solve the mystery of Margaret Sullivan's disappearance. But Emma noticed how his eyes never quite met hers, how his hands remained perfectly still while he spoke, and how the household staff seemed to hover at the edges of the conversation like guards rather than servants. Carlos's version of the events surrounding Margaret's disappearance was a masterpiece of careful omission, a story that acknowledged his family's involvement in the search efforts while providing no concrete details about what they had discovered, or why their assistance had been discontinued so abruptly. He spoke about the chaos of Carnival season, about the dangers that foreign tourists faced when they ventured into areas they didn't understand, about the tragic reality that some people simply vanished without explanation, despite everyone's best efforts to find them. His tone was sympathetic but firm, the voice of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of saying nothing while appearing to be completely cooperative. When Rosa pressed him for specifics about the medical records that showed an amnesiac woman being treated at the local clinic, Carlos's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the atmosphere of the conversation, a subtle tension that made Emma's skin crawl with the recognition of barely contained threat. He claimed to have no knowledge of any such incident, suggesting that rural medical records from the 1970s were notoriously unreliable, subject to errors and confusion that made them useless as evidence in missing persons cases. The conversation took on a surreal quality, as Carlos continued to deflect their questions while maintaining his facade of helpful cooperation, his answers becoming increasingly abstract and philosophical as he discussed the nature of memory, the unreliability of witness testimony, and the dangers of reopening old wounds that had never properly healed. Emma found herself studying his face for traces of her mother, wondering if Margaret had sat in this same room, had looked out these same windows, had listened to this same voice offering explanations that explained nothing. The possibility that her mother had been kept here, had been part of this household for decades, was almost too overwhelming to contemplate. But Emma forced herself to observe every detail of the estate, every photograph on the walls, every piece of furniture that might have been touched by familiar hands. Rosa's questions became more pointed as the afternoon wore on, her professional instincts clearly detecting the same undercurrents of deception that were making Emma's heart race with anxiety and anticipation. When she asked directly about the family that had brought the amnesiac woman to the clinic, Carlos's response was the first time his composure cracked. A momentary flash of something that might have been anger or fear before the mask of polite indifference slipped back into place. The interview ended with Carlos's suggestion that they abandon their investigation before it caused unnecessary pain to people who had already suffered enough, a recommendation delivered with the kind of gentle authority that carried implicit threats about the consequences of ignoring his advice. As they drove back toward town, Emma's hands were shaking so violently that she had to grip the door handle to steady herself, the weight of unspoken knowledge pressing against her chest like a physical force. Rosa's expression was grim as she navigated the winding road back to Villa Esperanza, her years of experience in missing persons cases clearly telling her that they were getting close to something that powerful people preferred to keep buried. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Emma of the last evening she had spent with her mother, when the world had still made sense and families were permanent fixtures in the landscape of childhood rather than fragile constructions that could be dismantled by a single night of chaos and confusion. That evening, as Emma sat in her hotel room reviewing the notes from their conversation with Carlos Rodriguez, a soft knock came at her door that sent ice through her veins with its unexpected gentleness. She opened the door to find Maria Santos, the elderly maid who had worked at the hotel in 1976, her face drawn with the kind of fear that came from a lifetime of keeping dangerous secrets. Maria spoke in rapid Portuguese that Rosa translated with increasing urgency, her words tumbling out like water from a broken dam as she finally allowed herself to speak the truth she had been carrying for 34 years. The night Margaret Sullivan disappeared, Maria had seen her being helped into a car by two men who worked for the Rodriguez family, men who had told anyone who asked that they were taking the injured American woman to receive medical treatment in the next town. But Maria had recognized the car, had seen it return to the estate just before dawn, and had noticed that the American woman was no longer in it when it passed through the gates. The next morning, Maria had seen a woman matching Margaret's description working in the estate's kitchen, dressed in the simple clothes of a domestic servant, her hair cut short, and her face bearing the confused expression of someone who had been severed from her own identity. The final confrontation began at dawn, when Rosa's contacts in the state police arrived in Villa Esperanza with a search warrant and the authority to investigate allegations of kidnapping and human trafficking that had been dormant for decades but never officially closed. Emma watched from her hotel window as police cars surrounded the Rodriguez estate, their flashing lights painting the morning sky in reds and blues that reminded her of carnival colors, of the festival that had stolen her mother and reshaped her entire existence. Maria Santos had provided enough corroborating testimony to convince the authorities that Margaret Sullivan might still be alive, might still be held somewhere on the property that had been hiding its secrets behind walls of wealth and influence for generations. The search would either end with a reunion that Emma had dreamed about for 34 years, or with the confirmation that her mother had died in captivity, that the woman who had taught her to read and sang her to sleep had spent her final years as a prisoner in a place that looked like paradise, but functioned like a prison designed to erase identities and destroy families. Carlos Rodriguez met the police with the same polished charm he had displayed during their interview, but his cooperation was now enforced by legal authority rather than offered as a courtesy to foreign investigators. As officers spread through the estate, searching outbuildings and questioning staff members who had maintained their silence for decades, Emma found herself walking through rooms that might have contained her mother's presence, touching walls that might have absorbed her voice, looking for traces of a woman who had been systematically erased from official records and public memory. The search took on the quality of an archaeological excavation, each room revealing layers of history that had been carefully buried but never completely destroyed. In the basement of the main house, investigators found a series of small rooms that had been converted into living quarters, spaces that were clean and well-maintained but clearly designed for confinement rather than comfort. The locks on these doors opened from the outside, and the windows were barred with decorative ironwork that was beautiful enough to pass for architectural detail but strong enough to prevent escape. In one of these rooms, Emma found a collection of personal items that made her knees buckle with recognition. A small wooden cross that her mother had worn around her neck, a photograph of Emma as a child that had been carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve, and a diary written in English that documented years of confusion, longing, and gradual acceptance of a life that had been imposed rather than chosen. Margaret Sullivan had been alive for at least 15 years after her disappearance, had been writing letters to her family that were never sent, had been maintaining her sanity by recording memories of her daughter and husband in a notebook that had become her only connection to the life she had been forced to abandon. The diary entries revealed a woman who had suffered from severe memory loss after her head injury, who had been told that her family had abandoned her, who had been convinced that her attempts to remember her past were symptoms of mental illness, rather than fragments of a stolen identity. The final entry was dated in 1991, 15 years after she had vanished, and it contained a prayer for her daughter's happiness and a hope that someday, somehow, the truth would be discovered and justice would be served. Carlos Rodriguez's confession came not through dramatic interrogation, but through the quiet persistence of evidence that had accumulated like sediment, layer after layer of testimony and documentation that made denial impossible and lies transparent. He had not intended to kidnap Margaret Sullivan. She had been injured during the Carnival chaos, and his family had taken her in with what they claimed were good intentions. But when her amnesia became apparent, when it became clear that she had no memory of her family or her life before the accident, the decision had been made to keep her rather than return her to people who might ask uncomfortable questions about how she had been injured and why her treatment had been delayed. Margaret had been told that her family had died in a car accident, that she was lucky to be alive, that the Rodriguez family had generously agreed to care for her despite her medical condition. She had worked as a domestic servant, had been treated well enough to maintain her physical health, but had been systematically isolated from any contact with the outside world that might have restored her memory or revealed the truth about her identity. The final revelation came when investigators found Margaret's grave in the estate's private cemetery, a simple stone marker that bore only the name Maria and the dates 1950-1991, the false identity that had been constructed to replace Margaret Sullivan when her real name became too dangerous to acknowledge. Carlos claimed that she had died of natural causes, that her health had declined gradually over the years, that she had been buried with the same care and respect that would have been shown to any member of the family. But the medical examiner's report would later reveal evidence of malnutrition and untreated illness that suggested neglect rather than natural death, a final cruelty that had allowed the Rodriguez family to maintain their secret by ensuring that the only witness to their crimes would never be able to testify against them. Emma knelt beside the grave where her mother had been buried under a false name, her hands pressed against the earth that had been hiding the truth for 19 years, and felt the weight of a lifetime of unanswered questions finally settling into the terrible clarity of confirmed loss. The justice that followed was both complete and inadequate, as justice often is when it comes decades too late to prevent suffering or restore what has been stolen. Carlos Rodriguez was arrested and charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, and obstruction of justice, crimes that would likely result in a prison sentence that would end only with his death. His estate was seized by the government, its contents catalogued as evidence in a case that would expose the casual cruelty of powerful families who had treated human beings as possessions to be acquired and discarded at will. Margaret Sullivan's remains were returned to Iowa for burial beside the headstone that Thomas had erected in her memory, a reunion that was both heartbreaking and healing, a final homecoming that had been delayed by decades of lies and silence. Emma stood beside her father at the funeral, watching as a community that had never forgotten Margaret Sullivan said goodbye to a woman who had been mourned as missing rather than dead, who had been loved and remembered even when her fate was unknown. The service was attended by hundreds of former students, colleagues, and friends who had carried her memory through the years, who had never stopped hoping that someday she would return to the classroom where she had inspired generations of children to dream beyond the boundaries of their small Iowa town. As they lowered the casket into the ground, Emma felt something shift in her chest, a door opening that had been locked since childhood, a space where faith and love could begin to grow again in soil that had been prepared by suffering but enriched by the discovery of truth. The bracelet her mother had given her, the one she had worn for 34 years as a talisman against forgetting, would never leave her wrist. But it would no longer be a reminder of loss and abandonment. It would be a celebration of love that had survived kidnapping and amnesia, death and deception, time and distance to finally bring a daughter home to the truth about her mother's fate, and the enduring power of a family's love to overcome even the cruelest conspiracies of silence and shame.